Imagine waking up tomorrow in Tudor England somewhere between 1485 and 6003 and realizing that survival depends on finding a job. What are your options? You could spend 12 hours a day standing knee-deep in fermented human urine, or perhaps you'd prefer to become a high-ranking noble with a job that revolves around monitoring the king's bowel movements and wiping his royal backside. If you're feeling especially adventurous, you could take the night shift in a cesspit, risking your life as toxic gases regularly suffocate your co-workers. Actually, scratch that last one. Richard the Raker gave it a shot, and let's just say it didn't end well for him. Welcome to a world where you'll uncover 12 of the most horrendous jobs in Tudor England, so repulsive and mind-boggling that they make your worst workday seem like a relaxing holiday in the Bahamas. And before you think I'm exaggerating, just wait until you hear about the man whose actual job title revolved around the king's bathroom habits. Yes, this was a legitimate position with a salary, and nobles fought tooth and nail for it. Let's travel back to a time when workplace hazards meant literally drowning in human waste, when injuries included having your feet dissolved by urine, and the perks of the job were limited to scavenging dead rats. These aren't fictional horror stories, they're real jobs people did day after day in Tudor England between 1485 and 6003. Number 12, the hand pin maker. At first, this job might seem like the least horrifying on the list, but stick with me. By the end, you'll understand why even this seemingly simple task was a daily nightmare. In Tudor England, pins weren't the mass-produced items we see today. Every pin was painstakingly made by hand, and the process involved 18 steps, 18 just for one pin, and the expectation that you'd produce thousands of pins per day. To make one pin, you'd start with brass wire, straighten it by hand, cut it into lengths, sharpen one end with a file, attach a tiny wire, head hammer it flat, and then polish it by shaking it in bags of brown and chalk dust for hours. The dust would get into everything, your lungs, your eyes, your hair. Pin makers frequently develop brass fever, likely caused by heavy metal poisoning from breathing in the brass dust all day long. A skilled pin maker might create 4,000 pins in one day, that's 4,000 times repeating each step. The work was so precise that it gradually destroyed your eyesight. Many pin makers were blind by the time they reached their 40s, their vision ruined from focusing on tiny metal points in poor lighting. The repetitive motions caused severe arthritis and the pay pennies, literal pennies for producing thousands of pins. Families often worked together to make pins, including children as young as 4 or 5 who were ideal for the delicate work with their small fingers. By the time they turned 10, they'd be fully engaged in the entire process, and by the time they hit 30, they'd be half-blind and crippled, replaced by the next generation of child labourers. The handpin making industry was finally put to rest by the Industrial Revolution, but for 3 centuries workers toiled away at their benches, slowly losing their sight and crippling their bodies, all while crafting the tiny metal fasteners that held Tudor England's clothing together. But the horrors of the past don't end there. Let me introduce you to number 11, the dog whipper. You might think we've already covered the worst jobs, but trust me, we're just getting started. Tudor England was remarkably skilled at creating jobs that combined physical discomfort, social humiliation, and baffling specificity. Case in point, the dog whipper. Yes, that's right, a dog whipper. This was an actual official position in Tudor churches, as it turned out that Tudor England had a massive issue with dogs in church. Picture this, it's a typical Sunday morning at your local Tudor church. The priest is trying to deliver his sermon. The congregation is packed, and in the middle of the crowd there are dozens of dogs. Lady Peaton's lapdog is yapping at Farmer John's sheepdog. The blacksmith's mastiff is lifting his leg on a pillar. 2 terriers are brawling over something they found under a bench. Enter the dog whipper. Armed with a long whip and a set of wooden tongs, the dog whipper's job was to keep the peace among the canine congregation. He'd prowl the aisles during service, ready to spring into action. A dog starts barking, whack. 2 dogs fighting out come the tongs. But here's where it gets interesting. The dog whipper's authority wasn't limited to just dogs. Unruly children, that's a whipping. Young couples getting a little too cozy, whip. Someone nodding off during the sermon, you guessed it, whip. Of course there were complications. Whipping the squire's favourite hunting dog could cost you your job, and maybe your teeth too. There are records of dog whippers being attacked by angry pet owners, bitten by the dogs they were trying to remove, and generally having a miserable time trying to maintain order in the chaos. The position lasted well into the Victorian era in some parishes, before finally disappearing as social norms changed and bringing animals to church became unacceptable. Now let's move on to number 10, the executioner's assistant. When we think of tutor executions, we imagine the dramatic moments, the axe falling, the crowd gasping, but there was so much more to it. Someone had to do all the prep work. Someone had to sharpen the axe, test the block, bind the prisoner's hands, and deal with the aftermath. That someone was the executioner's assistant, also known as the headsman. The assistant's job began by preparing the axe. When you're dealing with something as delicate as severing a human neck in one swift blow, it requires precision. Too sharp and the axe could chip on the block, too dull and the execution could turn into a messy affair. Anne Boleyn was fortunate enough to have a skilled French swordsman. During the execution, the assistant would bind the prisoner, position them on the block, and sometimes even hold them still if the prisoner was struggling. Imagine that your job is to physically hold someone while your boss chops their head off. But the true horror came afterward. The heads didn't just get quietly buried, they were displayed on pikes. The assistant would retrieve the head parboil with salt and cumin to preserve it, and then tar it to make it last longer. Yes, there was an actual recipe for preserving human heads. For traitors, simple beheading wasn't enough. They were hanged, disemboweled, while still alive, beheaded, and then quartered. Guess who was responsible for all of that? The assistant. While the profession evolved as execution methods became more humane, the assistant's role remained the same, doing the dirty work that made state-sanctioned death possible. And now, number 9, the bearwood. Bear baiting was to tutor England what football is to modern America, the national pastime. And someone had to wrangle these massive enraged animals. Enter the bearwood. The bearwood's job started with acquiring bears, usually cubs. They would raise them systematically, brutalizing them to make them mean enough to entertain the crowds. Bears were beaten, starved, and tormented. Their teeth were filed down and their claws trimmed, not out of mercy, but to prolong the fights. On fight days, the bearwood's job was far from simple. They would chain the bear to a stake in the middle of the ring and then release a pack of dogs to attack it. The bearwood had to stay in the ring the entire time, making sure the chain held, replacing any dogs that had been killed with fresh ones, and sometimes even prodding the bear if it wasn't fighting with enough enthusiasm. One wrong move and the bear could turn on him. There were multiple documented instances of bearwoods being mauled to death by their own bears. Bears are intelligent animals with long memories, and they didn't forget the abuse they had suffered. More than one bearwood was found dead in a bear pit, having been killed by an animal that had simply had enough. The profession finally came to an end when bear baiting was banned in 1835. Now let's talk about number 8, the raker. Imagine the worst public restroom you've ever seen, spread over several square miles, filled with dead animals, rotting food, and human waste. In Tutor London, there were no sewers and no garbage collection. People threw everything out their windows, and it all ended up in the streets. The raker's job was to scrape this filth off the streets and haul it to lay stalls outside to the city walls. They worked before dawn, armed with long-handled rakes, shovels, and carts that left a trail of filth behind them. On a good day, the streets were ankle-deep in muck. On a bad day, after a heavy rain, it could be knee-deep. Aside from the obvious disease risks, rakers had to watch out for chamber pots being emptied from windows above them. They also dealt with dead animals. A dead horse in the summer could bloat to twice its size and burst when moved, showering the raker in putrid flesh and maggots. Rakers were paid terribly, so many supplemented their income by scavenging for anything valuable they could find in the muck. The profession evolved as municipal services became more organised, but for tutor rakers it was a thankless and dangerous job, armed with little more than a rake and an iron stomach. If you're shocked by these revelations about our ancestors, if you never knew that your forebears literally had to deal with the streets full of human waste and rotting animals, do me a quick favour and hit that subscribe button. I've got an entire series of hidden historical truths that your teachers definitely didn't tell you about. We're talking secret societies, forgotten scandals, and historical conspiracies that actually turned out to be true. Trust me, the Raker story is just the beginning of how weird history can get. And then there's number 7, the saltpeter man. Saltpeter, crucial for making gunpowder, wasn't something that England had in abundance naturally. So they sent men with royal warrants to dig it up from people's homes. These saltpeter men had legal authority from the crown to enter any building and dig up the floors to collect the nitrate-rich earth. Wherever organic matter had been decomposing, like stables, dove coats, or even churches, they knew they'd find the precious nitrates. They would show up at your door with their royal warrant, and there was no way to refuse them. And they weren't gentle about it. Paid by the amount of earth they collected, the saltpeter men would tear apart stone floors, rip through wooden planks, and leave gaping holes in their wake. Fixing those holes? Well, that was your problem, not theirs. People hated these men with a passion. There are court records of homeowners attacking them with farm tools and entire villages banding together to drive them out. But no matter how much they were despised, the saltpeter men always came back royal warrant in hand, ready to destroy your floors in the name of national defence. This gruesome job lasted until the 17th century, when England began importing saltpeter from India. Now let's talk about number 6, the plague searcher. Picture London during a plague outbreak. People were dying so quickly that they couldn't bury them fast enough, and the city's brilliant solution hired elderly women to go door to door and determine if someone had died from the plague. The searchers were typically old women from the poorest classes who desperately needed the money. They had no medical training, just the dubious qualification of having seen many dead bodies. The city would pay them 4 pence per body inspected. Yes, 4 pence to enter a plague house, handle a corpse, and look for the telltale signs: buboes, blackened fingers, bloody froth. They had no protective gear, no masks, no gloves, nothing. The searchers were universally hated. People blamed them for spreading the disease. Families would even try to bribe them to declare the deaths as anything other than plague to avoid quarantine. When bribes didn't work, violence often followed. This grisly job continued well into the 17th century, before being phased out in 1836 when proper medical certification of death became mandatory. At number 5, we have the W dyer. W was the primary source of blue dye in England, but the process of making it was so foul that Queen Elizabeth I had banned it from coming within 5 miles of any royal residence. First you'd harvest W leaves and crush them into a paste. Then to ferment it, the key ingredient was human urine. The W paste would be mixed with stale urine and left to ferment in enormous vats, producing a smell that contemporary accounts described as beyond anything words could express. The fermentation process released toxic fumes that would burn the lungs, eyes and skin of anyone nearby. W dyers often went blind from prolonged exposure, developed chronic respiratory issues, and their skin would turn a sickly blue-green colour from constant contact with the dye. They spent hours stirring the vats with long poles, their faces in the path of rising fumes. Many of them passed out and fell into the vats, some drowning, while others were pulled out but never fully recovered from their chemical burns. Entire communities formed around W production, but they were universally shunned even by other tradesmen who worked with unpleasant materials. Number 4, the spit boy. Imagine the kitchens of Hampton Court Palace during one of Henry VIII's legendary feasts. Every roast had to be constantly turned evenly and without stopping for hours. Enter the spit boy's children as young as 7 or 8. They'd crouch next to massive hearths where the temperature could easily surpass 100 degrees. They had to grasp wooden handles and turn and turn and turn for hours without a break. The heat was unbearable. To protect themselves, they wrapped wet rags around their faces and hands, but those would dry out within minutes. If they stopped even for a moment, the meat would burn and the head cook would beat them. If they passed out from heat exhaustion, something that happened frequently, they'd be revived with water and immediately put back to work. They often worked nearly naked because any clothing would catch fire in those extreme temperatures. These children who worked as spit boys would crouch for hours on end, their bare skin exposed to the blistering heat of the hearth. Some of them worked grueling 18-hour shifts during major feasts, enduring in conditions so harsh that the job became obsolete with the invention of mechanical spit-turning devices in the 17th century. Now moving on to number 3, the fuller. In Tudor England, to turn raw wool into soft felted fabric, it had to be cleaned and compressed, and the method was nothing short of revolting. Human feet bare and unprotected stomped through giant vats of stale urine. Yes, the primary cleaning agent for wool was human urine, stale fermented urine that had built up enough ammonia to break down the lanolin in the wool. Fullers would collect urine from public pots on street corners and then climb into these vats to stomp it. They'd work barefoot, stomping for hours day after day. The stench was so overpowering that fullers were banned from living within city limits. The ammonia fumes would literally burn the skin off their feet, and many developed chronic respiratory issues from breathing in the fumes all day. This labour was typically done by the poorest of the poor, including children as young as 6 or 7. The fuller's trade finally died out with the advent of mechanical filling mills, but for centuries every piece of fine wool clothing worn by Tudor nobility had been processed by someone standing in urine. Next up, number 2, the groom of the stool. This was a coveted position among the nobility, with actual dukes and earls competing for the honour. They schemed and plotted all for the privilege of wiping the king's bottom. The groom was in charge of the king's close stool, essentially a portable toilet. But the job required so much more than that. The groom had to monitor the king's diet, keep detailed records of his bowel movements, and yes, perform the ultimate act of personal service, wiping the king's backside. But why would anyone want this job? In an age where access to the king meant power, the groom was as close to the king as anyone could get during his most private moments. This access made the groom one of the king's most trusted confidants. While the king was occupied with personal matters, the groom could discuss state affairs, make requests, and even drop hints about political appointments. The groom's role was to maintain meticulous records of the king's bathroom habits, noting the colour consistency and frequency of his bowel movements. These records still exist. Somewhere in the British archives you can find actual documents detailing Henry VIII's bowel movements. The position eventually became obsolete after the Stuart period as indoor plumbing improved and the role of the personal physician became more professionalised. Number 1 on our list is the gong farmer. Picture this, it's 300 in the morning in 1547 London. While everyone else sleeps soundly, one unfortunate soul is climbing down into a cesspit, armed with nothing but a shovel and a prayer. For a gong farmer, this was just another Tuesday night. In Tudor England, cesspits were large holes in the ground where all human waste from a building would collect. It would sit there fermenting, producing toxic gases and breeding disease until someone came along to empty it. That someone was the gong farmer. Because the stench was so unbearable, city ordinances prohibited gong farmers from working during the day. Can you imagine a smell so foul that an entire city deemed it unfit for daylight hours? Gong farmers would descend into these pits at night, armed only with a shovel and a bucket, standing knee-deep or sometimes waist-deep in human excrement. The gases were so toxic that many gong farmers passed out on the job. Some, like Richard the Raker, never made it out at all. He literally drowned in human waste. Once the pit was emptied, the waste had to be carted all the way outside the city walls. Now, after spending hours in a cesspit covered head to toe in filth, the gong farmer had to push a cart full of waste through the dark streets of London. The pay 2 shillings a night. But most gong farmers didn't live long enough to enjoy their earnings. The toxic gases, the risk of drowning, and the diseases they were constantly exposed to gave gong farming one of the highest mortality rates of any profession in Tudor England. And yet people did it. They did it because they had families to feed, because it was this or starvation. The profession finally ended with the advent of modern sewage systems in the 19th century. But for over 400 years, gong farmers were the unsung heroes keeping cities from drowning in their own waste. And there you have it. 12 jobs from Tudor England that make your worst day at work feel like a vacation. The truly remarkable thing is that people did these jobs day after day, year after year, generation after generation. They endured unimaginable conditions, faced death and disease every day, and were often despised by the very society they served. So the next time you're having a bad day at work, just remember at least you're not a gong farmer. At least you're not standing knee-deep in fermented urine. At least you're not boiling human heads for display on London Bridge. These jobs are gone now, made obsolete by technology, changing social norms and basic human decency. But their legacy remains in our labour laws that protect workers from exploitation, in our health and safety regulations that prevent unnecessary suffering, and in our understanding that human dignity matters more than economic efficiency. Can you imagine putting that on your LinkedIn profile? Groom of the stool-managed high-level sanitary operations for executive leadership. Yeah, I'll take my desk job, thank you very much. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go appreciate my modern bathroom and be thankful that nobody expects me to climb into a cesspit at 3 in the morning. God bless modern civilization, and may these jobs rest in peace, unmourned, unlamented, and most importantly, unrepentant. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.